Check, 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 check. The only people who are fans of the Beatles today, it seems, are weird conservative types. Your Canadian Conservative Prime Minister, former Stephen Harper, or boring middle-aged conservative men who drive PT Cruisers. And the same can be said for me. I no longer listen to the Beatles, but the Beatles were the soundtrack of my first memories. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Beatles played around the clock in my first memories of 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. Because my brothers played the Beatles constantly. They played them until their records were worn out, literally, and then they handed them down to me. And I got a hand-me-down record player, too, so I started playing the Beatles. Now, when you're 3 years old and you're listening to Obla-Dee blast outside your brother's bedroom door, you don't really understand what it's about. But you think it's cool. You think it's the only music there is. The only good music there is. And it's just hard to explain to my own children why the Beatles were so great. As I conclude 8 hours of Get Back, the Peter Jackson documentary. The fact is, in a fanciful world, believing in heaven, if I had died and gone to heaven, one of the magical experiences I would hope to have, the first thing I would say is, God, put me as a fly on the wall on the Beatles recording. Maybe this information of all the information in the world comes to you when you die, if you can be so fanciful. You know everything that there was. All the questions you asked in life are answered. But if I was that person in heaven, the first thing I would want to know is, how did they do it? I could never figure out what made the Beatles so special, what made them as great as they were. So different than everything else and so lasting that people shit themselves when the trailer dropped for this documentary, and we had to wait years to see it, and then it's here. And now I don't listen to Beatles music. Every time Beatles music comes out on some new format, when it came out in CD, I went to the library and listened to the CDs, copied the CDs onto hi-fi VHS tape, which is the best recording a person could do in their home, basically, without a great deal of money. And then, some hi-fi digital recordings came out a few years ago. I was on top of that, listened to it for a couple of days, but really the Beatles have left. I don't sit down and listen to the Beatles. Maybe I played some songs out of hopefulness that my kids would hear the same music I did growing up when they were little. Maybe I played it around the house. Maybe we played some music on the stereo as we danced around the house when they were children. But for the most part, I put it behind me, as I should have. I explained to my children, who are now 14 and 18, that the Beatles were unlike anything else. And that if they don't believe me, of course, every song that they listen to is ultimately influenced by something the Beatles did. If it's a rap music, I'm sure that music has influenced music, which has influenced that rap music. It's gargantuan what they did, and I was aware of that, and my mind wandered listening to it, and I became a creative person. I became an artist on those lonely days where my brothers ignored me but played Beatles music throughout the house, and my parents were at work. They were 10 years older than me, teenagers. And then I listened to the music myself, and I didn't, go out and buy records, but I listened to the ones that were handed down to me. And those, I didn't have, as a very young child, as a 6-year-old, didn't have the Rolling Stones Ghost Head Soup wasn't really accessible to me. But the Beatles were, for the most part. And not just the early stuff, but the later, more dramatic stuff and complex stuff. So, yeah, it's just, I'm satisfied after watching Get Back, thank you, Peter Jackson, that I can die now. I have that piece of information, that piece of knowledge of being that fly on the wall, and to see songs, even dumb songs like Octopus's Garden. I was singing that around the house in the swimming pool last summer with my kids, and there's a scene where Ringo comes into work early and he's like, I got this song. It's like 2 words, 2 sentences. And then George Harrison comes over and he's starting to say, oh, no, if you just did this and then that. To see the birth of something that is so grand, and to see Paul McCartney give birth to the song Get Back just by divining it out of the room, out of thin air. It's crazy. It's crazy to be there. And it's crazy to see, eventually they stopped forgetting or acting different because the cameras were there. I mean, arguably, you're always going to be a little bit closed off, but eventually the cameras were there for so long that they were forgotten. And I used to think highly of John Lennon. Now I think less of him. I think he was a more messed up person than any of them. I think McCartney was kind of the dad after Epstein died and was kind of running things, but I think Paul was kind of messed up. And it was for the whole Yoko Ono thing. It's really annoying to watch her literally glued to John Lennon. Like, why would you do that? Why would anyone do that? You're not teenagers. I know love, mad love, okay, cool. But, let your guy go do his thing, for fuck's sakes. Having said that, they're 28 years old and older, and they're at a point of their life where they're having kids and wives, and they're separating. And I think that's just what it is. It's just they're old. Creativity has often come in the music scene from young love and broken hearts and things like that. But when you get into marriage and children and divorces and other commitments, mortgages, properties, home decorating, you get distracted, and it's just the great work is behind you. And that's the way it was with the Beatles. But I'm satisfied. I don't know what to ask for if there's a heaven now. I mean, what is going to happen? So I failed my my colon cancer screening test, and it's probably nothing, like I said before. But COVID has come pretty close to home. My daughter is a close contact because of her school bus 8 days ago. And so she hasn't contracted it yet. But a kid behind her in class was talking about how her sibling was COVID positive. And I know how fast COVID spreads through families now. So I immediately picked her up from school and I took her out of school, which was fine with the teachers these days. But I don't know what to do because there's a very good chance that kid who sits behind her for 6.5, 7 hours a day, lunchtime, recesses, everything, is going to get COVID, is going to be positive. I mean, she's vaccinated, but it still spreads so easily through families. And I feel like I have many reasons that a case of COVID could do me in. Even with my vaccination, I'm due in the middle of December to get a booster shot, but that's after my vasectomy, my colonoscopy. Colonoscopies, actually, I've had a couple of them, and they've changed the drugs. I'm hoping the drugs are just as good, but we shall see. Yeah, I had a cousin who died a few years older than me recently, and it made me think that I'm not, I could die of a heart attack right now. I'm fat. Haven't had my heart checked in a while. What I do to my heart is, is not good for it, as my weight fluctuates in roller coasters from healthy to unhealthy, and the pandemic has made it unhealthy. Can't say why. It just happened. It's kind of scary that it happened, and I can't really explain it away. But my days feel like my life is complete if I do die. I've had the question answered of the Beatles. One of the most, mysterious things. I'm going to read you something. Because it's hard to explain to my kids what makes them special. How to sum it up. But this jazz professor was quoted in the newspaper. He says, in classical music, we started using the major scale and thinking in harmony in the early 1600s, and that eventually exhausts itself 300 years later by the time of Stravinsky and Bartók in the early 20th century. This guy's name is Pack. Last name is Pack. The Beatles did the equivalent of that in popular music in a compressed time period of 5 years. If you chart the melodic and compositional developments from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Sgt. Pepper's to the White Album, it's kind of a renaissance in music that is impossible to imagine happening more than once every century, and it's still being felt. Another thing from the documentary is, everybody's talking about this on Twitter, is that Mal Evans, the personal assistant / roadie for the Beatles, the guy who get them toast and tea and wine and whatever they were looking for in the recording studio. By the way, I thought they'd be more drugged up. They did drugs in the evenings, but they came into work hungover and straight and ate toast and tea by the ton. Mal Evans was the guy in the documentary, if you've seen it, who played the anvil. Maxwell Silverhammer hit the anvil, and he was just full of joy doing it. I mean, can you imagine if you were asked to play triangle for the Beatles? He knew that he was a nobody suddenly participating as in a song. And there's this just look of sheer childlike joy on his face as he's doing it that just burns into you and sticks with you, and everyone's talking about it on Twitter. And then I looked up his Wikipedia page, as one does when one goes down rabbit holes on the internet, and he met his demise by a police shooting only a few years later. It's terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. He moved to Los Angeles when John Lennon did. First of all, this guy split up with his wife, Mal Evans, got depressed, moved to LA where John Lennon was because John Lennon had separated from Yoko for 18 months for someone else who was his personal assistant, I guess, and Yoko's. And he got depressed and was on Valium and had an air rifle, and people called the police, and they knew it was an air rifle, but the police shot him 4 times anyway. And no Beatle attended his funeral. And his ashes were lost, and he had some interesting possessions like lyrics and things like that were disputed and fought over. And that's too bad. You watch that and you're happy and you're pleased for the guy, and then you read that that's how he died. It's just, this fucking world is so bad in so many ways. You think the Beatles would have gone to his funeral? You think John would have? Jesus, he was in town. So that'll be it for the Beatles for me, though. That'll be all that I'll ever do. I probably won't listen to their music anymore, but I feel like a mystery, one of the greatest mysteries of my life, the questions that I wanted to answer. I can't sum up the nuance of everything that has accumulated by watching this that has answered the question for me, but I will say that the Beatles were essentially broken up when they started this recording session and this film project, because I think they had kind of, you could tell that they were sad, that they knew it was over. It was like a marriage that was over, that they loved each other, but they knew it was over. And you could see the sadness in their eyes. And it was incredibly emotional at times, especially that lingering shot of McCartney where he could barely hold back. He says now there were, and then there were two. And it was a sad, sad thing. And he knew, McCartney knew, he said 50 years from now, people will laugh because the Beatles broke up. Just the fact that he knew people would care 50 years from now. A lot of times people don't realize the significance. As for the final concert, I was surprised that there weren't young people there. It was done downtown, so there's all these stodgy old people. Some of them were pro-Beatles, and some of them were like, stop this now, I'm calling the police. But I thought their fans, if it was now, they'd be on Snapchat and people would be flocking there, running down the street, coming out of apartment buildings and whatnot. So I don't know. The people who got to watch that concert didn't seem like they deserved to watch it. You know what I'm saying? There was very few young people. Hardly any, in fact. It was crazy. It was like performing a Beatles concert for an old folks home. I mean, back then. Not back now. I mean, you're practically hitting the sweet spot for old people. I'll be at an old folks home and they'll be playing the Beatles instead of waltzes and polkas like they did for my mother. Oh, that's a sad thought, but happy to think that I could get to that stage in life instead of dying young in the prime of my life and leaving an incredibly good-looking corpse, even though I'm 55. So here we are. Message resolved. The friendship, the brotherhood of McCartney and Lennon had a lot to do with it, but in this album, this project, you see Harrison as a sweet, soft-spoken man coming up with 2 or 3 of the greatest Beatles songs of all time were his. So that's just unique that, you could let Ringo sing a song and everyone loves it, or at least people kind of love it. They kind of laugh at him, but I mean, generally speaking, you had 4 people who could write and sing songs, and they sort of rubbed off each other in the melodies and harmonies, and everything was very unique. So that puts the end to my chapter of my Beatles life. I feel like I know. They were friends in high school, buddies. I didn't get that for the documentary so much, but it was alluded to. And they would go home after school every night and write songs. And they're losing their parents in their teens, and sort of their exposure to literature and wordcraft and poetry. It all just came together. It all came together. The Beatles get back. This is my thoughts on it. I'm James. I will be back soon. It's always my intent to talk to you every week. Bye for now.